Well, thank you so much for coming. I've been really excited about sharing this work. It's been a bit of labor of love, to be honest with me. I reckon it's been about a year and a half, probably in the making. And I really hope you find it insightful and actionable. I don't want to just talk to you for 40 minutes. I want you to get something from this. Um, I've left some time at the end for some questions, so do kind of keep those in mind as we're going through. And then, as I said, there'll be a little bit of time at the end to ask those questions. Just a quick warning. I'll be asking for some input now and again. Nothing too strenuous on a Thursday afternoon. No icebreakers or anything, but maybe some comments dropped in the chat. So if we could just test that very quickly, we just say hello, hi, howdy, a greeting, an emoji of your choice, whichever salutation you prefer. That would be awesome. We just drop a few comments in to say hello. Amazing. Hello, hello, welcome all. Okay, let me get started. So a bit of an agenda for today. So we're just going to do a bit of an intro and an overview. Intro to myself and Studio Republic, an overview of the tool. We're going to talk about the crafted framework, show crafted in action. So I'm going to talk through 2 case studies today, showing actually how we apply that. Quick summary, and then time for Q&A, as I mentioned. Here he is. So I'm Paul. I'm the brand lead here at Studio Republic. I've been a designer for around 11 and a half years or so. I've worked both in-house and agency side, from food and drink packaging to film to visual merchandise design in the last 4.5 years or so at Studio Republic, working on brand design, which I absolutely love. So a couple of projects I've had the pleasure to work on. One of the first being the Shen UK rebrand, the ACT website design, the social campaign for Strike in November, which is obviously very on brand for myself with my choice of facial hair. Some brand development for McPin, website design. We might have some of the McPin team here today. Hello, if you're in the room. Some accessibility tweaks and a website design for Rights of Women, a rebrand for Children with Cancer UK, and a rebrand and website design for Transport for All, both of which we're going to delve into as we start to look at how the crafted framework is applied. Studio Republic was founded in 2003, and it's built to amplify the purpose of charities. We're a B Corp, been B Corp accredited since 2019, which means we put people and planet before profit. We're a team of 13 across project management, UX, brand, and development. We're a fully remote team, all over the place, from Middlesbrough to Mauritius. I'm based in Weymouth and Dorset myself. It'd be lovely to hear if everyone could just drop in where you're calling in from today. Are you anywhere more exotic than Middlesbrough or even Mauritius? It'd be great to know where you're calling in from. Anyone wants to share? Amazing, amazing, lovely. Welcome, welcome. And we've worked with some absolutely incredible charities over the years, and there's just a few of them. So just a caveat before we kind of jump in, we're very much focusing on brand identity today, not necessarily brand, the capital B. So we're kind of making the assumption that any strategic work has been carried out. So purpose setting, mission, values, etc. That's all been completed. And we're very much focusing on the visual articulation of the brand, which I like to think of as a vehicle which allows individuals to see their personal beliefs and experiences reflected in a charity's purpose. So what that means to me is identity is that tangible element that communicates a charity's purpose and mission. And if someone can see their own beliefs, values, and experiences reflected at them, they're more likely to feel a resonance and that emotional connection, which is what we're all striving for. And that's essential that this purpose is communicated effectively, which is what led us to the crafted framework. So crafted is a mnemonic. I love a mnemonic because I'm a simple man. I draw pictures for a living. Made up of 7 pillars, which I'll go into more detail in a minute. But why did we create this? We found we were answering the same challenges time and time again, from proposal, pitch, but also working through project. And I suppose it's no huge surprise that charities often face very similar challenges. So we started to explore if we could create a more robust and measurable way to review this effectiveness. So we started to group these ideas by themes and these challenges, and we started to build this set of questions to evaluate against. So posing these questions across these pillars. So C being around consistency. So is every brand element used consistently across all platforms and materials? R for relevant. So does the identity align with both the needs and interests of a target audience and the charity's mission, values, and purpose? So the intercept between those two things. Accessible. This is a huge focus for us. Are the charity's identity and brand communications accessible to everyone? So I was reading this week, a recent study said that up to 96% of homepages analysed in recent years had detectable WCAG failures. And that could be from kind of low color contrast to missing alt text. And it's a huge focus for us. We've actually developed our own color checker tool. I don't know if anyone's used it, but it's a great tool. You can really easily check the entire color palette of your organization, and it will show those contrast ratios. And I can share that. I'll go into a bit more detail about that later. F is flexible, so the identity adaptable, scalable, and responsive across different mediums, communication styles, and audience. Trusted, obviously a huge one. Does the identity communicate the charity's mission and impact authentically and transparently? And kind of linked to that, emotive. Does the identity reflect the organization's heart and purpose? Does it use compelling storytelling to create an emotional connection? And lastly, distinct. So does the identity clearly articulate what makes the charity unique? Are the brand elements ownable and memorable in the sector? So now we've kind of understood what that framework looks like in those pillars. We've got two examples to go through to show actually the thinking behind that and how we can start to answer some of those challenges. And the first one we're going to look at is Transport for All. Transport for All have been championing the rights of disabled people and fighting for accessible transport justice since the 1980s. They use mass protest, campaigning, non-violent civil disobedience to draw attention to the issues of disability rights, blocking roads, handcuffing themselves to buses, essentially total badasses. But there was a lot of issues with their identity, which they were aware of. So one main one was around this similarity to Transport for London, this confusion around the two organisations. Obviously, the name itself is quite similar, but as you can see on the left-hand side here, the bottom left is a piece of material from Transport for London. The two around it are from Transport for All. So it's no surprise that there was some confusion around that. There's some huge inconsistencies with how the brand was being used. So you can see all of these various images here are all social assets that have been created, and there's just masses of inconsistencies from color to type to the graphical objects, but also just the structure. We always talk about the remove the logo test. If you take the logo away, is it still clear who that organization is? I would challenge that actually that would be quite difficult, and you might think that's 6 different organizations. Another challenge around kind of flexibility was the logo itself. So it had this very small strap line. When we were using it very small initially, it just completely disappeared. Just wasn't fit for purpose. A couple of things that they felt were working is some of the color use, some of the color exploration, some of these more vibrant, saturated colors they felt were actually suited some of their values and their personality. And additionally, the arrow element that you can see in some of the examples here, that they'd started to work with. No real structure or form to the arrows and how they were used, but they felt it could be a nice element hinting at that kind of that movement and that transport kind of vernacular and visual element. So where do we start from here? By asking lots of questions and listening very intently. So it's all about understanding those internal objectives, but also the challenges. So kind of functional challenges, but also those bigger picture items. So there's a few examples in here. We've got accessibility. So that's quite a functional thing that we need to check the identity and make sure that is working for everyone. But some larger challenges. So around reflecting our values and our history in the grassroots. So that relevancy. So being relevant to the history, but also the expectation of the user and becoming trusted by that community. And as you see on the far right, distinguishing us from Transport for London, so that was a clear area. And there were clear themes that started to appear very early on in the process, and they were echoed in our user research as well. So speaking with supporters, understanding their perception, what they'd love to see more of in the organization, and trying to find that overlap between the two. So the goals and the objectives of the organization and where they wanted it to move to, and echoing that history, but also the expectation from the users of being more bold, being more activistic and more campaign driven. And we identified that those primary challenges were definitely around being more relevant to themselves and their users, being more consistent, definitely, and being more distinct, and drawing that line between themselves and Transport for London. So we started to review the landscape, looking at other charity supporters might be interacting with in their day-to-day, but absolutely those government bodies, and just understanding how they're using their brand identity so we can start to make some clear distinction between. And we're always looking for opportunities to distinguish the brand from both the peers, but especially those government bodies, but also looking at these more aspirational organisations that maybe don't sit around them, but the way they're using their identity really chimes with those values and that personality traits that we're trying to achieve. So one of the first things we like to do following this is pull together a territory, and this is what we did for Transport for All, which is very much a mood board. So no real creative at this point, but just trying to build a world that potentially Transport for All could live in. So we're looking for that space to align that history and the values, but also those supporter expectations, and creating that distinct visual identity so they can really set themselves apart, create standout, build that awareness and that recognition, support and advocacy over time. Which led into this space of kind of this punky DIY zine approach and this very activistic style, using really bold color, very rough gestural handmade elements, and also this condensed typeface, which is so synonymous with kind of the activist visuals that we're used to seeing. Generally, in every project, there's a point that really unlocks the entire identity, a catalyst, for want of a better word. And in this example, it was all around the image archive. They had a huge image archive. We're actually working with the team now to build out this archive. And these images showed what TFA really were at their core. So they turn up, they disrupt, they shout, they make things happen. And there was a common thread seen throughout here, which we felt we could really leverage, which was around the placards. So they're really simple, they were DIY, they were handmade, and they're really bold. So we felt that could be an element we could bring into the identity, but more specifically around the electrical tape, as you can see in the examples on the far right. So there's something just really, really grassroots about this, that these were all made by hand and turn up to really make their point. And we really felt this could be a core component of the identity. Felt really relevant to that history, but also what was being expected of them from their users, and also really distinct. It could be a great way to define the identity moving forward. So we started to experiment. We used lots of electrical tape. We started thinking about how this feeds into the identity. How could this start to inform some of those graphical elements? So we had this early idea around the arrows, leveraging that, the kind of the research we'd found around that. We definitely liked this shorthand for pushing forward, and also it felt really aligned with the transport language, because they do move within the world of transport. We're not saying they're completely separate from it. So to acknowledge it is great, but if we can do it in our own distinct way, even better. So we started to experiment around this transport visual language and connection, which I thought could be a really nice point. And this is where we brought in the connection arrow. As you can see, these examples of actually linking transport for and all, and really pushing that home, that connection in this community, but also with this punky aesthetic, using this really bold, condensed typeface. And then we go through a stage of kind of refining this. So obviously inspired by this electrical tape and bringing that into the logo itself, almost feeling like the all is slapped over the logo. It feels disruptive and punky, like someone's put a sticker on a lamppost. But But we've really had to find this balance, and what I find in design is all about balance and this tension between two elements. So this is about, it needs to have this edge and this grip, but it needs to also be flexible. So it needs to work on the side of a billboard. It also needs to work really small on a mobile website. So we got very granular and very geeky about electrical tape and the characteristics of tape, what it could and couldn't do, and then refined, played with balance and sizing to ensure that it works across all applications, thinking about that pillar of flexibility, just to make sure it could work across everything. And this shows where we got to. So here's the before and the after. And I hope you agree. Please don't shout if you don't, because my ego is too fragile. But hopefully this really took them into a better place, more aligned with their history and that expectation from their users. Color was a huge element of this. So thinking about that conversation around accessibility, and again, this tension of expression versus accessibility. So it was clear that we felt we needed to have these really bold, punchy colors, but how to ensure that they're accessible? So again, we lent on the idea of the electrical tape, and that stark contrast of the black tape against the bold colors actually gave us this really great contrast. And I think all of the primary palette is at least double, if not all, AAA accessible, with the black against the lighter colors. We also created a recessive palette, which is the palette shown below, which we could then combine with those brighter colors to give us even more flexibility. But it meant we could lean into those darker colors if we want to be a bit more recessive, thinking about flexibility of tone, as well as actually using the brand elements. So we're constantly linking back to that reference and our initial territory, making it relevant to the history and those supporter expectations, but also being distinct in the competitor landscape, whilst ticking the box for accessibility and flexibility. So always just thinking about those things. Type was another area that really needed work. Massive inconsistencies with the existing brand. And again, finding balance between expression and legibility, which I think is kind of the theme of this project. So we knew very early on that we wanted to create a really bold, condensed typeface. So we did lots of work on trying to strike that balance between that tone and that personality, but also making it really legible. Additionally, finding a font that had lots of weights. Where possible, we really like to use Google fonts because anyone can download it and they're totally free. And it just means that internally as an organization, you're promoting consistent use because it's really easy to find and use. We often see where it's an old font or a paid for font, people can't get it, so they don't use it. So this starts to create these inconsistencies. We also created a whole set of custom glyphs. So again, using the electrical tape, as you'll see here, to create these punctuation marks and exclamation marks, meaning that we could start to pair those with the typography and create, again, these distinct moments. So we're not relying on the logo, we're actually building this distinction into every element of the brand. So it means we don't have to always rely on the logo. And again, with the image device, thinking of how this placard could come into play. So this two overlapping placard idea, bring it through into imagery, that relevance based on the history, but also this distinct shape that starts to become synonymous with the brand. But balancing that with flexibility and consistency by providing set aspect ratios. So we knew it could work across any use case, but we put the barriers up to make sure that it didn't go absolutely wild. And again, created a whole set of arrow variations. So we felt this was something we could really lean into. But consistency, because there's a shared language. So they're all created from the same material. They've all got the same DNA, but they're all different and they're flexible. And this becomes a really nice ownable asset to use. The connecting arrow itself was kind of explored in the logo, didn't come through into the final logo, but we felt it could be a hero piece of the brand. It's used on the hero banner of the website. And this draws attention to that subject and creates this connection. So overlaps, goes behind, it adds that depth, and has that feeling of kind of collective power and collaboration, which is some of those values of the brand. We also introduced paper textures. So really fitting with that reference of that of kind of the punk zine, um, but also again thinking about usability and that flexibility and consistency. So created a set of 6, ranging from the top left of quite subtle texture to the bottom right of actually quite grainy, aggressive texture. Which meant that actually when they started using those elements, there was a choice around we want to lift it a little bit, we want to add some depth, but we can be really subtle or can we actually be really expressive? And that's shown, I think, really well in this diagram, from the left being really restrained to the right of being expressive. And I often talk about this idea of fix and flex. So which elements stay the same and which are expected, and which elements can change so it doesn't become stagnant and boring. So in here we've got kind of set elements, but then we use color, texture, the arrows to actually change that feeling from restrained to expressive. And we're being consistent, so it feels like the same brand, but we can be really flexible and playful within that framework that we've built. And talking of that framework, obviously that is a lot of assets. I think I exported around 400 separate assets at the end of this project, which is a lot. But an essential step is creating this detailed guidelines to capture all of that. So lay out the toolkit of pieces, and then show exactly how they can be used. So how and when to use. We even get to the point of using kind of mathematical equations to define sizing and spacing and alignment to ensure that consistency throughout. And that's a really big piece of this puzzle, is that we often see that guidelines are just either severely lacking, out of date, or just not even used because the brand has just grown as it does very naturally away from the original brand. So that's a key component of this, is that we can create these sprawling, really flexible identities, but actually without that guidelines to pull it all into place, it can just become completely inconsistent again. And then just a couple of visuals pulling that all together to show where we took the brand to. Hopefully, you'd agree that this very much positions them into that space, being more relevant to their history and their users, but also giving them that flexibility and that playfulness to really stand out. And hopefully, and if this isn't the case, maybe I should quit. Some real distinction between Transport for London. I really hope there is no confusion between the two. And a really nice element of this is that we got to the point where one of the arrows could actually be used as the shorthand. So again, thinking about not having to rely on the logo, but using this icon as a visual metaphor and a connection with the brand itself, as you can see in the pin badge. So yeah, much more relevant, much more distinct. And in turn, though, creating that greater emotional connection and more trusted. Which I think is worth just diving into a little bit here, that the 7 pillars of the framework can absolutely be tackled in silo, but they're definitely a compounding effect. And so by solving one problem, actually really greatly benefits another. So by increasing that relevance and reflecting those personal beliefs in the brand, we create that great emotional connection, and over time create that trust. So just something to bear in mind. So I'm just going to ask a question at this point. I'm just going to check the chat. I saw something pop in there. Okay, cool. Okay, I'll keep an eye on that. I'm just going to ask, obviously I know we've got a couple of charities in the room. And now I've kind of gone through the framework. It'd be really good to understand if anyone has started to give this some thought around, is our identity really working as hard as it can be for us? So just to give me a break to have a sip of tea, if we could have a think about this and drop some thoughts in the comments. So G for green, our identity is super effective, flexible, consistent, and accessible. No issues here. I just want to Skype off for an hour and listen to you talk about brand. Awesome. A for amber, our identity is pretty effective, does most things well enough, but could do with some help. Or R for red, our identity is a shambles. So if you just want to drop a letter in the chat. Oh no, we've got a red and an exclamation mark. We've got an A. Amazing. The A's I'm hoping are coming from our existing clients. Would be good. Amazing. Thanks so much. I will take a sip of tea. So I'll go into the next case study. Amazing. So, Children with Cancer UK. So, for over 35 years, Children with Cancer UK have been funding life-saving cancer research, providing emotional and financial support to families dealing with childhood cancer. They've raised over £300 million, invested almost £10 million in family homes near hospitals so families can be together, but still relatively unknown compared to some of the larger cancer charities in the UK. At the time when we started working on them, they just had a new CEO, Joe Elvin, so it felt like a really pivotal time for the organisation. They'd completed some brand strategy work with the phenomenal agency Still Curious, developed a new vision of a world where every child survives cancer. And they made some really clear decisions around kind of the tone and the personality that they want to inhabit and how that needed to be reflected in the visual identity. And I would just say on this project, as a dad, this one really resonated with me. This is a really special project. Totally heartbreaking. I definitely shed some tears working on this project, but I think you have to put your whole self into these projects to get the best results. And yeah, I'm super proud of this work still. So, yeah. So here's where they were when they came to us. Quite cold, quite clinical, very restrictive in terms of the toolkit of parts they had. They had this hexagon device, which is not the most ownable, especially in kind of that healthcare medical world. Quite a restrictive palette, two core colors, if you take out the two kind of light grays, and not scalable at all. The logo itself, you can probably see here, the strapline itself, completely illegible at smaller sizes, but also so much detail in the logo itself. So there were some definite functional challenges from the team. So around flexibility, being overly complex, so really difficult to use or recall, which is obviously a really important one for looking for that support. Because if you can't recall, it's difficult to find initially and then either get or give support to that charity. Again, relevance issues, but bigger than that, an emotional disconnect. That being around the logo. So the logo itself and the strapline, which contains helping children and young people with cancer ring the bell. So whenever I start a project, kind of I look through identity, get an understanding of the toolkit of parts, and I start to think, okay, where's the equity? What are the parts that are definitely going to remain, and I'm just going to give them a tidy up, or I'm going to reimagine them or rearticulate them. And in my mind, the bell or the hexagon or both would be those elements. But talking through the team, it's yeah, I suppose we have these biases and these understandings, but the sad reality is not every family or child gets to ring the bell. So whilst its heart was definitely in the right place in terms of being that hope, it was deemed really controversial. Actually, they'd had some quite negative feedback about that. So it's really interesting that actually that's the power of that audience insight and thinking about actually what that means to people. Because as I say, heart was in the right place, but actually quite from an emotional angle, quite disruptive. Another thing picked up in those early stages from Jo herself was this offhand comment around could the logo look like it was actually giving support, which is quite an odd challenge, but quite an interesting one. It certainly got the cogs spinning. But Jo also challenged us to do the opposite of what had become the charity style in her terms. So, not saying there's anything wrong at all with this style, but as that smaller charity, they really needed to shake things up and do something different to stand out. And I remember we even talked about getting to a really granular level around how the words should stack, the alignment and the separation of words, even capitalization, to try to understand what others are doing and how we could do things a bit differently. But more importantly, how could we create that emotional resonance that was really distinct, relevant to those various audiences, whilst making the logo look like it was giving support. Really, really easy challenge. But we started to think about what this might look like. And the simplicity of a hug seemed a really powerful metaphor for support. So from a parent to a child, parent to a parent, or even a colleague to a colleague, whatever age, in that kind of the best and the worst time of someone's life, that felt really appropriate for this project. So how could we bring that idea and that emotion through into the identity? So I went back through my old hard drives and I found the first iteration of this. And actually, it's not at all a million miles away from the final logo, which sometimes happens, very rarely, but sometimes. Um, and it was all about this odd stacking of the word. So no left alignment, right alignment. It was quite this kind of unusual stacking of the word, which actually opened up the structure and created these recesses in these negative space to allow these arms to intertwine and actually support the text. And I'll admit it was a bit weird. I wasn't convinced, even though I had created it. I remember having internal discussions around the logo, and I think I had two or three other concepts, and I was like, I don't know if this makes it into the presentation, which shows I know nothing. But we did include it, and there was something about the immediacy of it. It's quite literal, but because it was graphic, it just translated really well. It really resonated with the team. And whilst we explored those other variations, the final mark really didn't change that much at all. And as I say, that doesn't always happen, but lovely when it does. But as always, we refined it. We refined the mark, softening corners slightly, just trying to think of that softness and that emotion that we're trying to elicit, making it really approachable, and also tweaking alignment, improving optical balance, and again ensuring that this could work. It's scalable, it's flexible, and it can work at any size. And through the research and discussions with the team, we identified a few areas of color that could work in terms of creating that hope, that exuberance, and that emotion, which is really where we were trying to position this. And really thinking about that personality trait, that emotion that we want to get from the identity. And although that structure felt right, and as a mark, and looking at the competitive landscape, it just felt too close to Cancer Research UK. Children with Cancer UK and Cancer Research UK often partner on initiatives and research, so they would appear together in a lockup. So it's really crucial to create a clear separation between the two. So we revisited colour, and we really felt it was an opportunity to own those warmer oranges. So that felt hopeful, really inviting and warm, and vibrant without being too intense. And coupled with deep purple, the colour, not the band, to act as a background contrast, it felt distinct owning those two colours together, but tonally right for that emotion we were aiming for, and thinking about that relevance and that emotion. We also introduced the shades of teal to allow the brand to flex between support and research, which are the two arms of the organisation, and it enabled the team to you kind of leverage the warm or the cool side of the color palette when talking about different subject matters, talking to different audiences. And we defined some accessible color combinations. So the color palette that I was mentioning earlier, this is the output of that. So the matrix on the right, it looks pretty intense, I appreciate. But this is the output of our color checker tool, which I can share after this if anyone would like to give it a go. But this basically gives us all of the accessible color combinations we can use. So we can define those in guidelines, one, for consistency, and two, just to make sure we're always accessible. In addition to that, we've created a color weighting system to help the team even further. So came up with this 60-30-10 split of color usage, which meant that we defined which colors could be used together, and now we're defining that color balance. Again, trying to create flexibility within the system, but also always consistent throughout. And then a bit of a comparison where they were and to where we took them. So much warmer, hopefully you agree, much more emotionally resonant, and definitely more distinct. And crucially avoids that potential upset that original logo and what that was causing to some families. As always, we don't work on logo design, we work on system design and identities. So we started to explore how those arms could actually inform a whole system. So becoming this framing device which heroes and supports the imagery held within, supporting children themselves and their families. And then for flexibility, we also explored other ways for the arms to be used. So they could be oversized and interactive. We just get a sneak peek of some of the angles. They can create depth in a composition. But also playful shapes with the arms just hinted at through negative space, as you can see in the example on the right. Really fun, but also essential in creating as many ownable assets and opportunities for recognition as we possibly could. Because we get that comment a lot that we don't have enough stuff, so enough parts of the toolkit. And as I mentioned before, there is always this tension of lots of bits and how to use them and being really consistent. So it is essential that the brand guidelines are really robust, really detailed to make sure that we can have consistent use. But enough flexibility so it doesn't become boring. Children Cancer UK has one of the highest amounts of London Marathon entries. So we want to make sure that they were really noticed on race day. So we created a device using the arms to create this repeat pattern that could be applied to jerseys, which just looks so bloody good. Yeah, it's really interesting working, especially remote. I'm here in my spare room in Weymouth, and I'm working in a very digital space. So when you see your work out there in the real world and capturing the logos and designs that you've created in the real world, and you can see the joy and the love and the community effort to raise funds and support these amazing charities. It's an absolute delight. It makes all the long days all worth it. So to reflect on Children Cancer UK, the goal was to not only solve some of those functional issues, but to create a modern, distinct, and expressive identity with that great emotional connection, which could really support them and give them the fame that they rightly deserved, and support that phenomenal work, hopefully for the next 35 years and more. So, summary. So what? So your identity is the vehicle to deliver your story. So it better be up to the job. And why is that important? So if it's not working for you, it's working against you. If your identity isn't effective, how are your supporters supposed to remember you or even find you in the first place? Trust, support you, and become lifelong advocates. And how? Well, the first step is knowing who you are and defining that purpose. So I know I said at the beginning we weren't really touching on that element of it, but to make the point that Transport for All and Children Cancer UK really knew who they were. As a team, they had a shared purpose. They'd clearly defined their mission and their values, and they really knew where they wanted to go. And once you have that, you're able to then assess your identity to see how effective it actually is at delivering on that purpose and that promise. And you can then define those challenges and those opportunities and almost like gap analysis from we're here, we want to get here, how do we get there? And what hopefully we've created and what I can share with you after this, which is super exciting, is our crafted tool. So taking all the findings from the framework that we've created, we've now built a tool, which we'll be sharing with you after this, so you can test your identity. So it's really straightforward to use. I think there's 2 questions per pillar. Try and answer as honestly as possible. It's definitely not about shaming or picking fault, but it is really about if you're honest with yourself about those the good and the bad of the identity. And this will really help to highlight any issues internally with or validate any concerns maybe that you had or make business cases for change internally. And once you've done that, obviously the next step is then acting on those challenges. Absolutely, some can be done in-house, and there's some things you can do. And sometimes you may want to lean on a creative digital partner, I know a couple, so you can reach out and I can point you in the right direction of Studio Republic. But yeah, this tool, we're super proud of it. We've been using it internally. We've done lots of QA on it. We think it's working pretty great. You are going to be the first people to use it outside of Studio Republic. So if you spot anything, you're not clear on something, you can see an opportunity to make it better. We'd love to hear from you, because obviously we want to make it as good as possible, and we want to help as many charities and their users as possible. That is our goal, to amplify purpose after all. So, do you have any questions? I'm gonna stop sharing so I can actually see everyone's faces and not stare at a blank screen. You don't have to turn your cameras on. Feel free though. It'd be lovely to see some other humans. I did see a couple of questions coming through. Let me just have a quick look. So there was a comment around who wrote the text. I think that came through from Transport for All. Lucy, I think that was. Yeah. I believe they did all the copywriting internally for that project. But they did kind of rework all of their copy to be more in line with that vision of where they wanted to go. Who adapts it? Another question: how do you adapt your work to be relevant to small charities and provide them with tools which we maintain across time with limited resource? Yeah, that's such a common question for us, and it's definitely around, not to harp on about guidelines, but guidelines are brilliant for that. And we often hear the feedback when we start to present these concepts of, oh my God, there's so many bits, so many things to consider. Are we not just going to become completely inconsistent again? And it really is about that, giving you enough that you can be really consistent and you can be really flexible, but not enough that it can just go completely haywire again. So absolutely, there's some things that can be done even for small teams. A consistent use of the brand is such a not an easy or a quick win, but that's absolutely something that can be handled by a really small team internally. Auditing your identity, how it's being used, looking at the brand guidelines. They don't have to be. Our brand guidelines are pretty great, if I do say so myself, very detailed. But it could be a PowerPoint, as long as everything is captured and it's clearly defined, the elements of the brand to be used, how they can be used. I read this week, and I couldn't find a really clear source for this, but it said that consistent use of color and type could create an up to 80% increase in brand recognition. As I say, I tried to find the source. I don't disagree. 80% seems high, but I think consistency is such a such an easy thing to think about. I think that would be a real focus for me. Couple of
Could I
questions
just say
of
something, which
course.
is, as somebody who has run a charity, had a brand, rebrand, and then had brand guidelines, it was really important for me that we had things brand that people could understand and use. And even that was quite challenging, but keeping it super simple.
Yeah.
Even though you then lose some of the nuances and all that, because staff turnover and just trying to keep on top of it. And the second thing was to have a brand ambassador within the organization. So ideally you've got a comms officer, but have somebody who's saying before things go out and keeping a check on consistency, because again, as chief exec, I'm like, I've got to raise money and run the staff, and you need someone who's really like the champion for that. So it's just two
100%.
really pragmatic things from running a small charity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I play that role with Studio Republic. So I'm the brand lead. So I am the person. That hex code on that color is not quite right. So yeah, that's such a good point. Absolutely. That's great. So there's a question here again. So around any tips on getting non-comms brandy people to stick to appreciate importance of brand guidelines? That is a great question. And that's absolutely that. I think that starts at the beginning. So that's really about bringing people on the journey of why, the importance. And we've done that internally. Um, but I think involving the team in those decisions around the importance of doing that. So it isn't those colors need to be the same because they need to be the same. That's not the purpose of doing that. The purpose is we want to build recall and recognition of our brand because we want to build an emotional connection. We want people to support us and become advocates for us. So I think just positioning it in that way and giving the context of why we're doing this, the importance of being consistent, would hopefully bring people on board. Will I be sharing a recording of this? Absolutely. We will have that on the website, so we can share a link to that. Question: mention charity style when speaking about. So the charity style that I mentioned with Children of Cancer UK, and again, I will caveat this and say this is not a bad thing, but I think in our research we'd noticed that there is almost this tendency to have an icon, have a stacked set of words that are left aligned and locked up with said icon. Again, nothing wrong with that, but for the case of Children of Cancer UK, it was imperative that they really stood out from that. So we noticed that through our research, and actually this is becoming a bit of a theme. Let's intentionally move away from that. How do you check that the brand identity resonates with the target audience? Again, that's involving at various stages of the process. So very much at the start, so understanding their perception currently, but also what they hope. What do they want that organization to deliver for them? What do they need from them? And then once it depends on the project itself, but as you move through that process, just to kind of sense check against that. So does this now feel more relevant? Does this give you that correct personality? Does that give that align with your sensibilities? So I guess it's about definitely involving at the beginning of the process, but also then checking as you go and making sure you're much more relevant as you move through. It's kind of around digital accessibility. How about digital accessibility with the team? Was that part of the journey you had with them? To be honest, sorry, I kind of mumbled that to myself. There was a question around the awareness of digital accessibility. We're finding on almost every project now, it's mentioned in the brief. So I think it's really, and especially, I think we're really fighting the corner for this in the charity sector. The awareness of accessibility is so much greater for charities. And actually, it's like I can't really remember a brief that it hasn't been in. So not necessarily that we know how to do it. We're kind of looking for guidance on how to do it and best practice, but we know we want to be there. So yeah, absolutely. From our perspective, we're seeing an awareness of that on almost every single project, which is obviously phenomenal. Alex, if an organization does many discrete things, is there a case for distinct flavors of branding for its different areas? Yeah, definitely. And that's another thing we come up against quite frequently as well. It might not be exactly what you mean by the question, but we always get around those audiences and those tones. So the different areas of focus, there's different conversation types. How do we flex the identity to speak to those? And that's always a consideration as we're building the identity, to know that actually here's the fullest expression of the brand. And when we're really looking to make noise, maybe it's around fundraising or events, and we want to be really expressive. But actually, we also speak to government and ministers, and we need to be able to tone that back. So that's absolutely built into those brands, and it's those conversations we have at the beginning of projects to really understand how do you need to flex, and how can we build that into the system. Do you recommend giving the toolkit to individuals to complete themselves in isolation or to complete it once in a group? I think it'd be really interesting to see the results. If a whole team was to run the tool, if they all came back with exactly the same scores, that'd be really interesting. because I guess it's all about perception. So the reason we framed it in questions is to make it hopefully a bit easier to be able to be honest with yourself and do we do that? Do we always do that? And then hopefully that makes it simple. But yeah, I'd be really interested to see actually as separate entities in a team, yeah, how that comes back. But yeah.
Future iteration of the tool, I think, Paul. It's having a group
Oh
log.
yeah.
We could average out the scores and yeah, interesting.
What have we found here? TFA guidelines, online guidelines. You found that, Dave? Is Dave still with us? Yeah, cracking job. There's another thing to mention actually is all around. This is a thing we've been exploring this year is digital guidelines. So the kind of the old school way is to create these huge PDFs, which as you'll probably find, Lucy, you might have found this with staff turnover. Someone has a PDF on their computer. They need to send it to someone else. There's a version 2 that's floating around. There's this was changed. We've started to build digital guidelines. So they're hosted on a single URL. They can be updated in real time. There's a single link. It holds all of the components, logos, colors. One click, you can download all the assets. So yeah, that's something interesting to think about as well. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, be interesting to try. Another question from Tom. Tackle typefaces when it comes to email marketing platforms. Oh, yeah, that's a big one. So basically, brand fonts versus system fonts, I think is to summarize that question. Yes, it does throw a spanner in the works sometimes, Tom. And it's something we get asked a lot about as well. In the brand work, we will typically define a system typeface. So we'll try and find the most appropriate system typeface that we can that maybe shares some of those commonalities with the branded typefaces. But yes, it can hurt when you see your lovely design put into Word, for example, and Arial is used in place of a really nice typeface. But we try and at least give guidance on the closest approximation or some shared characteristic in how the type is styled. But again, because there are multiple elements to the brand, we can keep the brand consistency and that recall through the other elements. So, for example, Transport for All, we have the connect and arrow. It on their letterheads, it disappears off one side of the page, comes in another. We've got the logo. And actually on their letterheads, because they're using a system typeface, but they've got these other brand elements, it still was really on brand. So I suppose that's the beauty of having all these kind of touch points with the identity. So you've got these several areas of recognition of, oh, that's that brand, that's that brand. And it means that when you have to move outside of that, so for a system typeface, it isn't lost and you can still get that recognition. What programs do smaller charities, those without in-house designers, generally use to utilize these elements? Canva is the go-to, I would say at the moment. That seems to be the best. I know Figma you can use free on a limited license, but it's quite intense, quite a steep learning curve. Figma. Canva's quite intuitive. And it can, yeah, that's something we actually define at the beginning of a project is actually who is going to be using this toolkit, what are their capabilities, what is the software, and then we can export any assets to be able to use as easy as possible in those pieces of software. But yeah, Canva's a great shout, and Adobe is extortionate, so I can understand why charities might not want to fork out for that.
The other good thing, sorry, Paul,
Yeah,
with Canva Pro is you can set up a brand kit in it, so you can define your logos, your colors, your typefaces all within there. So then it's selectable
yeah,
rather than giving anyone completely free reign. You can start to limit it down a little bit in there as well.
yeah. Take out some of the thinking,
Yeah.
which is always good, always great for consistency. So you're not guessing. Um, any other questions? Or shall I get this email together and share the tool so you can actually try it out? Because that's what I want to see. So please do share. Once you've done it, you'll have my email. Please do share your findings. I'm really interested to hear how it works. If you find anything interesting or surprising, yeah, we'll send that shortly after this call. Yeah, I'd love to hear. And I will, unless there's any other questions, I'll leave you to your days. Amazing.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Take
Everybody.
care. Bye. Bye.